If you were born somewhere in that narrow stretch between the late 1970s and early 1980s, you've probably spent a good portion of your adult life fielding a question you can't quite answer cleanly. Are you Gen X or Millennial? And the honest answer is neither, not really. Which isn't a complaint. It's actually a psychologically interesting condition that researchers have only recently started examining more carefully. Here's what most people in this window eventually figure out in midlife. The discomfort of never fitting the category isn't a personality quirk. It's the psychological output of specific timing. And once you understand the timing, a lot of other things start making sense. How you handle change, why security feels like something you can never fully trust, and why you carry a kind of awareness that people on either side of you don't quite seem to have. We're going to get into exactly what produced that. Hit like and subscribe, because the next video in this series goes somewhere most psychology channels won't touch. Now let's get into it. Sociologists began using the term Xennial around 2014 to describe this specific cohort, people born roughly between 1977 and 1983, sometimes stretched slightly wider in either direction. The window is narrow enough that some researchers classify it as a microgeneration, not a full generation, a specific slice of historical timing that produced something worth paying attention to. What made that slice different wasn't personality, it wasn't values, it was when things happened and where people in this window were developmentally when those things hit. People who study generational development often observe that the timing of major transitions matters enormously, depending on where a person is psychologically at the moment of impact. The same event hitting a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old produces entirely different outcomes. For Xennials, the two defining transitions of the late 20th century, the shift to a digital world and the economic collapse of 2008, both arrived at the worst possible developmental moments. That combination left marks that are still visible in midlife today. Childhood for most people born in this window looked a lot like childhood for kids 10 years older. You came home from school to an empty house, let yourself in with a key worn around your neck on a shoelace, and didn't see a parent until dinner. After homework, you might have wandered the neighborhood until dark without anyone tracking where you were. Nobody expected a check-in. You figured things out or you didn't, but either way, you figured them out alone. This wasn't neglect, it was the standard operating environment of American childhood in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Parents weren't hovering. Neighborhoods were considered reasonably safe social containers. Kids were expected to manage time, boredom, and small problems without adult intervention. Developmental psychologists who study childhood independence consistently note that this kind of unstructured self-management, repeated across years, builds a particular psychological profile, specifically higher frustration tolerance and a stronger internal locus of control. The child who solves the problem themselves, even badly, develops a different relationship to uncertainty than one who always had an adult nearby to intervene. That profile is still visible in Xennials today. People in this cohort often describe an unusual comfort with ambiguity, not comfort in the sense of enjoying it, but in the sense of tolerating it without panic. You get what I'm saying. They were trained young to sit with unresolved situations until something shifted. Then adolescence arrived, and the analog world made patience structural rather than optional. If you were a teenager in the mid-1980s to early 1990s, the social mechanics of daily life required waiting. You passed handwritten notes in class. If you made plans on Friday, you showed up Saturday and trusted your friends would be there. No way to confirm, no way to cancel without a phone call to a landline that someone might not answer. If you missed a television show, it was gone. Not available on demand, gone. What this created psychologically wasn't just inconvenience, it was repeated low-grade practice in trust and deferred gratification. Behavioral researchers have long observed that the ability to tolerate uncertainty in social situations is closely linked to early experiences with uncontrollable waiting. Xennials were trained in this, not deliberately, but structurally, because the technology simply didn't allow for any other approach. Don't pretend you don't remember what that felt like, and don't pretend it didn't shape something. Then, within roughly a decade, the entire system changed. Consider what happened to someone like William, born in 1979, grew up in Houston, spent his teens in the analog world, and his 20s watching it dissolved. By 22, he had a cell phone, a MySpace profile, and a job in IT he'd essentially taught himself. By 30, he had a mortgage and felt, for the first time, like the floor was solid. Then 2008 hit. William's story isn't unusual. It's a pattern that researchers who study economic trauma during early career establishment have documented consistently across this cohort. The economic crisis didn't just cause setbacks, it recalibrated something. Risk tolerance, institutional trust, the basic assumption that stability is something you can count on, all of it shifted in ways that didn't simply reverse when the economy recovered. People who lived through 2008 in their late 20s and early 30s often describe a background vigilance that never fully went away. Not panic, not dysfunction, just a low-level second-guessing of stability that runs underneath everything. A quiet reflex that says, don't get too comfortable because you've watched comfortable disappear before. That vigilance sits right next to genuine adaptability, which is an unusual combination. The same person who is completely capable of navigating change also carries a quiet assumption that the floor might drop out. Both things are true at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's the logical output of a specific developmental history. Now here's the piece that explains the adaptability itself, and it goes deeper than most generational analysis bothers to go. Neuroscience research on the brain maturation has established that the prefrontal cortex, the region most responsible for complex adaptation, identity consolidation, and integrating new behavioral patterns, continues maturing through the mid-20s. This means people born in this window were still inside a high neurological plasticity period when the entire technological landscape reorganized. They were old enough to have built a stable psychology inside an analog world, old enough to carry real memories of what that world demanded, but young enough that absorbing a completely different paradigm still felt natural rather than threatening. This is what distinguishes Xennials cognitively from both groups surrounding them. Older Gen Xers had already formed most of their adult identity before digital life arrived. The adaptation was real, but more like learning a language past the acquisition window. Later Millennials have essentially no psychological memory of a pre-digital world. For Xennials, both worlds are genuinely native. The fluency runs in both directions. Researchers who study technology and generational cognition sometimes describe this as a form of psychological bilingualism, not metaphorically, structurally. The cognitive habits built in one environment coexist with habits built in the other. That's where it changes. That's when you realize why people in this group move through disruption differently than their colleagues on either side. They've already done this once. The whole world reorganized, and they came through it functional. Drop a comment if that tracks for you, because that's the part most people in this cohort say nobody ever names. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. What researchers increasingly note about this cohort in midlife is how well they hold contradiction. Independent but socially aware. Skeptical of institutions but not entirely cynical. Comfortable with technology but genuinely capable of being without it. Shaped by economic trauma but functionally adaptable. These aren't balanced traits in some ideal sense. They're the result of being shaped by incompatible environments and having to integrate both without the luxury of choosing sides. Gen X had a coherent cultural identity to claim. Millennials had a coherent cultural moment. Xennials had the pieces of both and the full version of neither. "I've outgrown it" is something people in this group say about a lot of things as they move through their 40s and into their 50s. The proving phase, the hustle for legitimacy phase. I'm not chasing that anymore. Not because they gave up, because they've been through enough to know what's actually worth the energy. That's a different thing entirely. What's left underneath all of it? The adaptability, the vigilance, the bilingual relationship to technology is something harder to name but psychologically real. A particular kind of perceptiveness, the ability to see what something costs even while appreciating what it provides. To remember what was lost in a transition without romanticizing the past. To understand that change produces genuine gains alongside genuine losses because they watched one world replace another during the exact years when such things leave the deepest impressions. That isn't nostalgia. Nostalgia simplifies the past into something better than it was. What Xennials carry is closer to contrast awareness, a persistent knowledge of a before that makes the after more legible and more complicated than it looks to people who only ever knew one version. You start noticing this in midlife, the caution underneath the adaptability, the patience underneath the digital fluency, the vigilance underneath the calm. Most of it traces back to that narrow window in history when everything changed at once, and they were exactly young enough to absorb it, and exactly old enough that they'll never fully forget what came before. And if you value this kind of content, the best way to support the channel is by hitting that join button below. It genuinely keeps this whole thing going. If you're ready for more right now, I've linked a video on screen that dives into a different topic, but with the exact same depth. Click on over, and I'll see you there.